Hey everybody, Mr. Bruss back here, and I just wanted to create a short video that goes over the lecture guide from the first day of natural selection. So that was the day we did a simulation in class. And prior to that, we talked briefly about a couple examples of how species had responded to human interventions to the environment, but that we saw adaptations happening within the human lifetimes. So I'm just going to go over that just so that's a little bit more clear. And I'm going to share my screen from my iPad here. So let's share the screen and then we'll go to that lecture guide and see just kind of what I was talking about there. So this is here part 5 of the natural selection. And this is what we're going to cover today. So the first is kind of a very large question that gets at something that I'm not going to test on, but I want to plant the seed and get you to start thinking about it. And that is, how do you get order and complexity from random mutations? So the idea is that random mutations to DNA can eventually lead to a slight change in that protein, which gives the trait a slightly different change, either no pigmentation, darker skin pigmentation, different eye colors, different immune system, that these totally random mutations could lead to some sort of advantage at some point in time. And that's this order and complexity that we see in living organisms. And the real thing is that these random mutations are happening all the time to DNA, and the vast majority of them are have no effect or are detrimental, so that the organism doesn't survive to pass on that trait. But as the environment changes, as different organisms enter a new ecosystem because of changes in environment or human intervention, certain traits get selected for. And that's how this order and complexity happens, is because there is pressure, there's selection. So that is a big question. This is like a graduate college level question. But really what we're looking for is traits are favored or selected. Okay. So that's a pretty broad question. Now we can get a little bit more specific into this. So this is the one with the peppered moth. And remember, the peppered moth, there were kind of two colorations, a lighter, a white coloration, and a darker, a black coloration. And prior to the Industrial Revolution in the United Kingdom, in London, the light colored peppered moths dominated. And it was thought, because they could kind of blend in to the light colored birch trees, where the darker moths stuck out and were much easier to be seen by birds. So here we're saying that the dark mutation is the dominant and the light mutation was the recessive. So dark is dominant, light is recessive. Before the Industrial Revolution, what genotype do you think was most common? Well, I think little g was most common, because that would equal the light colored. Did any other genotypes exist? Well, sure. I'm sure there was some GG and some big G, little g, because I knew from the reports that there was dark colored moths around. And I don't know which of those genotypes there were. They're probably a mix of those. If you take AP Bio, actually, and as you continue with your biology education, you'll learn about this Hardy-Weinberg principle, where you can actually mathematically determine some of this stuff. So that's something to look out for in the next couple of years. During the Industrial Revolution, how do you think the distributions of genotypes changed? Well, we know that I think that there was a decrease in the homozygous recessive. There were fewer light-colored moths, and there was an increase in GG and probably an increase here. So that's just showing that what I want us to get thinking about is not just the colors are changing. We don't decide we want to be a different color. It's these distributions of genotypes. All of these different genotypes existed prior to the Industrial Revolution, but as the environment changed, certain of those genotypes became favored. Okay, so this is only this rock pocket mouse is another example kind of similar to the peppered moss, where there's different colors of the mice. And in the rock pocket mouse, what mutation happened to the original mice? Well, there was actually a mutation that gave the mice a lighter colored. There was a light colored mutation. And this did give them an advantage because the sand, the ground, over time, geologic time, had become lighter colored, more sandy colored. So it did give them an advantage, and they blended into the background. You can watch that video to get some more details on this, but we didn't spend time in class on this. So these are not questions that I will ask about on the test. Interesting stuff, just not going to be directly tested. Okay, so here was a kind of main thing we talked about with this simulation. And I just want to identify that we assigned the white color as dominant and the brown color as recessive, okay? So what are the possible genotypes of the white rabbits? Well, they could be, I'm gonna use, what should we use here? Their fur. So they could be big F, or big F, little f. And the genotype of the brown rabbits is has to be recessive. So that was little f. And what affected, so this was kind of the situation. And the brown rabbits were a minor percent of the population until we introduced wolves. And the idea of this simulation here is that we're assuming that wolves are hunting by sight, and against this brownish background, the white rabbits are much easier to see, and thus the wolves go after them much more quickly than the brown rabbits, which kind of blend into the background. What effect did wolves have on the rabbit population? It decreased the population. Did it affect all the rabbits equally? No. Let's just answer that very simply first. No, it did not. They preferentially hunted and killed the white rabbits. How did the genetic makeup of the rabbit population change with the introduction of wolves? So the white rabbits decreased population, and the brown rabbit population it relatively increased, right? So maybe there could have been, maybe there was no change in the brown rabbits, but the white rabbits went down, and now the brown rabbits made up a larger percent of the population. How did the genetic makeup? So I'm thinking there was a decrease in big F, and probably a decrease in the heterozygote, big F, little f. And there was a relative increase in the brown rabbits, the homozygous recessive. Okay, in the situation where there's only brown rabbits remaining, could these rabbits ever produce a white rabbit? And so we thought about doing a little Punnett square here, thinking back to our genetics unit. And if you do that square, you'll recognize that you can only produce homozygous recessives from that. So there's no way that, given the current conditions, that they could produce a white rabbit. And we're imagining that this ecosystem is closed. It's not, a white rabbit can't wander in. If it could, that would, you could imagine now you're introducing a dominant allele, which can move through the population. But in a closed environment, you would need a mutation. And this actually happens in nature. You could imagine that there's some mutation that pops up and it gives the rabbit a light color. And maybe a few of these are starting to survive in the environment just because there's so many brown rabbits that wolves, even though the brown rabbits are harder to see, there's just so many more of them that they're more likely to catch a brown rabbit than the small population of white rabbits. So the small population of newly created white rabbits is just kind of hanging out in the population, maybe for thousands, maybe for millions of years. And then you might, maybe the environment changes again. The sand, the ground becomes much lighter. Maybe some salt or something has baked into it. And you might imagine that now the white rabbit has some advantage. So these things can change over time. So what other traits in rabbits may be selected for with the introduction of wolves? So maybe speed, right? Maybe maybe like becoming, like favoring nocturnal behavior, nocturnal, maybe favoring fast digging, really anything that would help a rabbit, any trait, any slight difference that would help a rabbit evade predation, get away from the wolves, might be favored, right? And so like in the human population, we all have a mix of, there's slow twitch muscles, which kind of help you go for a really long time. And there's fast twitch muscles, which are the ones that give you that sprint and that acceleration. And different people have different distributions of slow twitch and fast twitch muscles, and that's controlled by genetics. And you can imagine that same genetics would happen in a rabbit. And maybe one of those, having more fast twitch versus slow twitch, would help dodge the wolf initially. Or maybe the way these wolves hunt, it's more beneficial to have more slow twitch, and you can keep running and you never tire out. And if that is an advantage, that you can, the endurance to keep running and never tire out, if that becomes an advantage, then those rabbits will survive and they'll pass that gene on to their offspring, and that will become more prevalent, more higher percent of the population. So this is introducing us this competition in nature, this predator-prey competition that can sort of drive different traits to be favored, which can then lead to adaptation and over time evolution. So that's that page. I think in future videos, we went on and talked about the second part of this natural selection. So I will stop it right there, and I will see you next time.